of America. And as Jim knows, there's been other articles like this since the current administration came into office, especially in recent times, and especially by foreign countries, Canada and other places, who have long ago respected the U.S. They may not have always agreed with them, but at least they respected them. And so this article is written by Wade Davis from University of British Columbia. By the way, his wife is an American, and but he looks at the state of America today. And I'm going to just discuss highlights of the article. And you can go online if you want to read this article. It's about 20 pages long, and pick it up. Really fairly easy. And so, okay, I'll get started. Go ahead and Chip. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, there we go. So, okay, let's get started. I'm summarizing this article. Now, it will be, this was written back in early August, so some of the figures and stuff might change a little bit. It's amazing how quick things change nowadays. But anyway, COVID-19. In a single season, civilization has been paralyzed by a parasite 10,000 times smaller than a grain of salt. Isn't that amazing? Our interventions today have largely focused on mitigating effects, such as wearing masks, hand washing, social distancing, and sheltering in place. There is no treatment at hand and no certainty of a vaccine in the near future, despite what some people may say. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, there we go. Hysterical similarities. Pandemics and plagues have a way of shifting the course of history. For example, in Europe in the 14th century, the Black Death killed half the population. And peasants revolted and resulted in the end of the feudal order, which was the predominant order of that time. In 1914, the assassination of anybody who's read history knows about these things. The Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, started World War I. Stock market crash in 29 and 33, rise of Adolf Hitler. All these rather significant events left to very consequential outcomes. And COVID-19 will be remembered as such a moment, according to this author. Next slide. With 2,000 dying each day, much more than other developed countries, we're talking about America, Americans found themselves in a failed state and ruled by a dysfunctional and incompetent government. The exceptional U.S. became a country of pity. As reported in the Irish Times, they felt compelled to send disaster relief. I don't know if they did or not, but they felt they should. And another thing, no empires last forever. 15th century belonged to Portugal, 16th to Spain, 17th to Dutch, Britain the 19th, of course, US 20th century. So the implication there is no empire lasts forever. And I'll talk a little bit about the Roman Empire later. But anyway, next slide, please. In 1940, a can-do America, and that's really what we had in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Europe ablaze in leading up to World War II, and war had already been going on there. Had a smaller army than Portugal, but within 4 years, 18 million men and women served in uniform and worked double shifts in factories and mines. Made America the arsenal of democracy. Henry Ford's Willow plant produced B-24 Liberators every 2 hours, round the clock. And shipyards in Long Beach put out Liberty ships at 2 a day. Just imagine that. And in the wake of the war, with Europe and Japan in ashes, shortly after the war, U.S. accounted for half the global economy. And with a strong trade union movement, allowed a single breadwinner with limited education to own a home and car, support a family. I was born in the Great Depression. And after World War II, I was a very young man. But the expansion of suburbs and so forth, and people coming back from war, getting the GI Bill, or just going to work in their factories, a single person in a family could support a family. That was a fact in the 50s and even the 60s. And anyway, go ahead. Next slide. In truth, in many respects, in economic terms, our country, America, 50s and 60s, resembled Denmark as much as America today. Marginal tax rates for the wealthy were 90%. Of course, they never paid that, but they did pay a lot more than they do today. Salaries of CEOs were on average just 20 times that of mid-management. Today, the base pay of those at the top commonly earn 400 times out of their salaried staff, and with many earning much more with stocks, options, and perks. That's the change since the 50s and 60s. The elite 1%, imagine this, of American control 30 trillion in assets. I have, and I still teach at community college, some economic courses. And first thing I put on the board is what $1,000 looks like, $1 million, $1 billion, and $1 trillion. Each one of those adds 3 zeros. That's a lot of money. So they control 30 trillion, while the bottom half have more debt than assets. Next slide, please. Again, trends and inequality is what I'm talking about the last 50 years. The 3 richest Americans have more money than the poorest 160 million. The median wealth of black households is 1/10 that of whites. Just imagine that. But really, they didn't have any opportunity to create wealth, especially after World War II. And a lot of other people were able to get good loans and at least develop equity in a house, that sort of thing. The vast majority of Americans, white, black, and brown, are 2 paychecks removed from poverty. And black Americans, and that's somewhat also true for Hispanics, are 3 times more likely to get COVID-19 for all kinds of reasons, mostly because they're working in jobs where they're exposed to other people. Next slide, please. Other indicators of American demise. As a number of countries move to control device, U.S. stumbled along in denial. If less than 4% of the world population has soon accounted for more than 1/5 of the deaths. A country that once turned out fighter planes by the hour could not manage to produce paper masks or cotton swabs essential for tracking the disease. A nation that defeated smallpox and polio and led the world for generations in medical innovation and discovery was reduced to a laughingstock. The president was advocating the use of household disinfectants as a treatment for disease, and that's what he was doing. Next one, please. The Republic had defined the 3 other indicators of American demise. Flow of information, lifeblood of democracy. It ranks 45th today among nations, press freedom. In a land that once welcomed the huddled masses of the world, now builds a wall on the southern border and separates refugee parents from their children. U.S. laws define freedom as an individual's inalienable right to own a personal arsenal of weaponry. And in the past decade alone, 346 students and teachers have been shot on school grounds. On school grounds, imagine that. Next slide, please. The American cult of individualism. Where have we heard that before? It is still dominant. It's still trying to conquer the West. The American cult of individual denies not just community, but the very idea of society. So no one owes anything to anyone. We all must be prepared to fight individually. Education, shelter, food, medical care. What does prosperous and democracy deems to be fundamental rights? Other democracies, and I've been in most of these countries, whether it's Europe, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Canada, where there's universal health care, equal access to a quality education. In the US and here in New Mexico, if you live in a rich district, you have a much better school than a poor district. That's not the case in these other countries. And a social safety net for the weak, elderly, and infirm. America dismisses this as socialist indulgences, as a sign of weakness. What a bunch of crap that is. Okay, next slide. Now, I've spent time in Denmark back when I was working with the Department of Agriculture, and I was had started the Sustainable Ag program, which is at the university called SARA too. They had they were really out front so far as farming with reduced use of chemicals and pesticides. But anyway, Danes earn roughly the same after-tax income as Americans, while working 20% less. They pay in taxes an extra 19 cents for every dollar earned. But in return, they get free healthcare, free education from preschool through university, opportunity to prosper in a thriving free market economy with lower levels of poverty, homelessness, crime, and inequality. They have a very capitalistic economy in Denmark. But when a person, say, loses their job, the state takes over and retrains them in an area where there is opportunities. The industry doesn't have to worry about that. But they're very, for example, the ships that Walmart uses to go back and forth to China, they're made in Denmark. The average worker is paid better, treated respectfully, rewarded with pension plan, maternity leave, and 6 weeks of vacation a year. So the idea, if you have a system of both capitalism and socialism that works right, it really does work. I've seen it, and it does work. Next slide, please. So just the conclusions. Evidence of U.S. decadence is a choice that so many Americans made in 2016 to prioritize their personal indignations by placing their own resentments above any concern for the fate of the country and the world. By electing a man whose only credential for the job was willingness to give voice to hate groups, validate their anger, and target their enemies, real or imagined. Next slide. I think this is the last one. The end of the American era and the passing of the torch to Asia is no occasion to celebration, and no time to gloat. If and when Chinese are ascendant with their concentration camps for the Uyghurs, the Muslim group, the ruthless reach for their military, the 200 million surveillance cameras watching every move that people make. We will surely long for the best years of the American century. Anyway, this is what this Canadian university professor, that's a summary of what's in the article. And now we'll move on to Jim, if you, and yeah, you can take this off, please.
All right. Am I still on? Okay.
Yeah. So go ahead, Jim. Respond to what he put forth there.
Sure. First, thank you for inviting me to do this. This is good fun, even if it's a very serious kind of topic. Now, this article by Wade Davis really suggests that America has been unraveling for a long time, but that the COVID crisis and our lack of leadership on this issue from the current occupant of the White House has become made the unraveling all that more evident. There are a lot of themes in this article, as you've seen, and Paul's done just an excellent job of summarizing the argument. We might add to that. Paul mentioned that there's been a lot more like this, but even this morning, Fareed Zakaria, who has the show on CNN, asked the question of whether or not the US was becoming a banana republic. And what he concentrated on mostly was the election and the attacks on democratic institutions and even freedom of the press, as was mentioned in the article. But if you think back even a decade ago, no one would have been asking if the US was becoming a banana republic. It just wouldn't have happened. The other thing that is fairly recent, within the last week or two, the Pew Research Center released its annual global survey, what they call a global survey of attitudes towards the United States. It's really a survey conducted in 13 nations, mostly European. And according to Pew, only 16% of the people they interviewed had confidence in Trump as a leader, and a similar percentage regarded the US highly, and that's the lowest in the 2 decades that Pew has been doing this kind of survey. In terms of leadership, even Putin had higher marks than Trump in terms of leadership. Another just published article by John Pfeffer from the Institute for Policy Studies, and he just published an article saying that America's global reputation isn't coming back soon. And in that article, Pfeffer also talked about the Pew survey, the lack of leadership on COVID, but also the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, the Tehran Agreement on nuclear stuff, and other issues that make it very difficult to claim that America is leading the world someplace. Now, one of the things that Pfeffer mentioned in this article was that this is a lot different from when the United States became the global leader in almost everything, and Great Britain had passed that torch to another democracy, the US. And we're likely to be passing this torch, according to Pfeffer, to China, which is hardly a democratic society. Yeah, I don't want to put that too long. But it's a very, very different situation. Now, let me, in the Wade Davis article and in Paul's slides, there was mention of American exceptionalism. And that's an old theme, that somehow America is simply better than anywhere else in the world. Like Paul, I've lived in a lot of different places and traveled a lot. And I've always been skeptical of the idea of American exceptionalism. There are exceptional people all over the world and exceptional things happening all over the world. But if there's anything called that reputation for American exceptionalism, seems to me to rest on 3 things. One is our democratic institutions. The second one is economic power, our ability to produce almost anything, anywhere, anytime, and our role in foreign policy. So as an economist, let me go back a little bit in history and talk about America's economic progress and its possible exceptionalism. And what I want to talk about is the 20th century, not the 21st. And during the 20th century, as far back as we've got data, US gross domestic product increased at an annual rate of about 3%. Over the whole century, it was interrupted twice. Once by the Great Depression, where output went down considerably, and once by World War II, where we increased GDP by 50% in just 3 or 4 years. The rest of the time, the nation just chugs along. And if you put that in per capita terms, per person terms, that's about 2% a year, which means that by the year 2000, we had about 8 times the GDP per person that we did in 1900. 8-fold increase in a century. If there's American exceptionalism, it was certainly the 20th century. There have been times when other nations have grown faster than the US, but there's no time in history where a nation has grown that rapidly for an entire century. Maybe 14th century China, but we don't have the data to support that. There are no guarantees in this growth game. Just because we grew rapidly in the 20th century, and for the last half of the 20th century certainly dominated the world in terms of economic power, doesn't mean that's going to go on for another century, as was kind of pointed out in the article. But the case for American exceptionalism there makes you ask, why is it that the United States grew like that into such a powerful economic engine, and other places did not? And it seems to me that the answer lies in policy. For most of the 20th century, the United States had the best educated workforce in the world, had the healthiest workforce in the world, had the best transportation infrastructure anywhere in the world. We could move things around, and with no internal barriers to trade, that helped a lot. And at least from World War II on, we spent more on research and development than anyone else in the world. And those things paid off. By the end of the 20th century, none of those 4 things, education, health, transportation, investment in R&D, none of those 4 things were true. The United States was not a leader in those areas. And so if you look at what's happening in the 21st century, it should come as no surprise to us that we aren't doing the kinds of things that we need to do to keep up what went on in the 20th century. It just won't happen without those 4 things. And the other thing I'd like to mention there is that starting at the end of World War II with Bretton Woods and later the Marshall Plan and our foreign policy, it was the deliberate policy of the United States to rebuild those economies that had been damaged by war. And when the developing nations, what we now call the developing nations, got loose from the colonial powers of Great Britain and France and other places, it was our deliberate policy to try to encourage them to grow rapidly. After the 1972 opening with China, it was also our policy to have China be successful. And we pursued that, and that can be regarded as an American success story, that other nations are growing rapidly now. Okay, now, but it is just not the case that we're going to have this American exceptionalism for the next century, at least not unless we change some of our policy things. The other thing I'd like to bring up is the fact that I've heard the demise of America, the unraveling of America, if you like, all my life. I'm not as old as Paul, but I'm old enough, to remember when the Russians put Sputnik up in the air. And it was a shock to the system. It was a terrible shock to the system in 1957, I think it was, when that happened. And we responded to that a little bit by increasing our expenditures on science and even foreign language and all kinds of things. In the 60s, America was coming to an end because we had these horrible, horrible things going on. We had the Vietnam War, we had distrust of government because of that, we had assassinations, we had that horrible year, 1968, and there were riots in the streets, not only in the Black communities, but also in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention, just a horrible situation. In the 70s, we had a government that essentially had to resign. We had Watergate and the continuation of those things that had gone on in the 60s. In the 1980s, Japan was going to dominate the United States because it had figured out how to manufacture things, allegedly, a whole lot better than we did. And they were going to become the country of the future, and the US was going to lag behind. And that 80s and early 90s, by the early 2000s, we had all kinds of things going on here, the increase in inequality, we had 9/11, we had all kinds of stuff that all pointed to the demise of American exceptionalism. So my point here is not just a history lesson. I like history. Maybe I should have been a historian instead of an economist. But to suggest that we've heard this story before and that it is possible to overcome some of these things. Now, when I read this article, I couldn't find a lot to disagree with. Davis was correct. There is no question that our reputation internationally has been damaged by the last 4 years. There's just no way around that. And that we have tremendous issues at home, some of which are long-standing issues that even predated the current occupant of the White House. But it's a very powerful argument. And why don't we open it up to questions, if you like? Paul? You're muted, Paul. Paul, you're muted.
Maybe that's just as well.
Thanks a lot, David. Okay. You hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And the one thing I want to add to what Jim was talking about, and I know we've come back from really dire, Great Depression is one of them. I I was born in the Great Depression, and I obviously don't remember it, but I do remember my father, and he was a pretty good farmer. He almost lost a farm during that time, and we would have been out in the street on the rail cars like everybody else. And so it was you want to talk about dramatic events, that was surely one of them. But over the last, I just want to interject in regard to the last 40 years, the increase in income inequality has really been serious. I mean, by some of the figures that was quoted from that article, but I've looked at them too, and I'm sure you've looked at them also, Jim. The extent to which the bottom half of the workforce has not really had a increased wage for many years, yet the price of everything they buy, whether it's housing or food or whatever, transportation, that's all gone up. And so you got to have two people working, and if just over the last 40 years, the increase in income inequality, and that predated Trump, I mean, there's no question about that, is also a big problem we got to overcome. So with that, let's open it up for questions and comments.
Paul, I agree with you. And let me just remind everyone that inequality and poverty, which is a separate issue, you can have a very equal society and have everybody poor. Those are policy issues. We decide to have poor people. This is not something handed down to us from nature or anything like that. Those are policy issues.
Yeah. So any other comments, questions, people? Go ahead, David.
Well, I guess you were extolling the virtues of the Danish system. It has a lot of advantages, seemingly, and clearly if you said comparing it like over the last century, the American century, it went through some tough times because of the war. It wasn't as successful.
Oh yeah, no question.
But was their government altered a lot during that century to get to the point where they are now, to have this more socialistic egalitarian system that's?
Well, I think, I think most of Europe learned from America, quite frankly, in the 60s and 70s. We had a fairly, pretty good, the people that were working in factories and so forth, they had good paying jobs, they had unions and this sort of thing. And quite frankly, a lot of the European countries and others, other places I've been, New Zealand, Australia, and so forth, and Japan, quite frankly, they copied what we were doing and developed, quite frankly, quite transparent governments. And so they've gone one way, and we've gone another way.
Okay. Now, the difference there, is that because they were less individual in their orientation? You made the point about.
I think that's true. Like I said, I was the OECD representative from USDA for about 3 years. I spent a lot of time, and the headquarters is in Paris. And yeah, I think Europe in general just has a more cooperative kind of attitude about life. We have this individual psychology that goes way back to discovering the West. And that was part of it, no question. These other countries really do have a more cooperative kind of attitude about working together where they need to work together, and the Danes especially do.
Thank you.
Yes, Jane.
Since I am a retired educator and I'm intensely interested still in what happens in education, I follow the research both nationally and around the world, and particularly the research of the OECD on education. And these are the 34 most prosperous countries in the world. And those countries that are really doing well have really wiped out inequality and have a good standard of living for everybody. are the countries who have invested in education and healthcare.
Right.
And I just think it's if you look at the data, it's undeniable. And some of those countries started 50 years ago. For instance, Singapore, where the average person did not have more than a third grade education, back when we had good levels of education and good support for education in our country. They're now the most sought after country to do the work of very high level technology jobs. Very similar kinds of things happened in Finland, and there's all kinds of examples of that. But one of the things that I keep thinking about is, if anybody has read Robert Reich's book, The Common Good, he says that in our very own country, there have been almost steadily 50-year cycles where we start out very focused on the common good, caring about how we affect each other by our behavior in society and looking out for everyone. And then slowly over time, we revert back to this very individualistic philosophy that I don't care about anybody else. All I care about is what's good for me. And I'm going to do whatever I want to do, no matter how it affects anybody else. In his book, he says, you know, we could re-energize the common good again. It's going to be much harder this time, he believes, but there's a possibility of that. So I want to know what you and Jim Peach think about the possibilities of indeed doing that, so that we might begin to level inequality and begin to see a good standard of life for everybody. What do you guys think is the possibilities?
Go ahead on that one, Jim.
Oh, I was going to suggest that you go first. You know, it is difficult for me to think that we're heading in that direction. To go back to a time when the common good, or the good of the nation, if you want to call it that, was a high priority. We are incredibly divided. We just are. And that shows up in every presidential election since JFK. And, you know, the nation was divided then. And it was divided along lines of, do we support the community? Some of the issues were different. But it remains, and it has become even more of a bitter division. And I would hope that we can overcome that, but it's going to take a while. Let's even suppose that, I try not to be too political on these things, but let's suppose that Joe Biden wins. Trump has been the big divider. He really has over the last 4 years. It's going to take a while, no matter who is there, to recover from the kind of bitterness and divisiveness that we've had. Social media has not helped. And the divisions, you know, we now all go to we're kind of siloed. We listen to people who agree with us. I rarely listen to Fox News or look at any of the blogs that are really right wing. That's just not me. And I think most people are like that. And it is a world of difference. We can't even agree on facts, much less policy. And I worry about that for the future of the country. Maybe Paul wants to chime in.
Yeah, I just, even back in the JFK and Nixon time and so forth, yeah, there was differences, but Nixon, when he got into office, he started the EPA. Can you imagine any Republican doing that today?
Right. There is a marvelous book about Kennedy and Nixon. I think it's called Kennedy and Nixon, and explaining that ideologically they were not that far apart.
Right.
they were both Cold Warriors. They both professed this almost religious belief in the market. They, they were not that far apart.
Yeah, but I mean that, and I know they had divisions, but compared to today, and especially with the constant push to the right of our basic fundamental beliefs, individualism, that's a good way to describe that. You survive on your own. If you can't survive, go and homeless and jump off the end of the earth is our attitude today. I mean, that's kind of sad. That was not that's not the country I grew up in when I grew up in Minnesota. It just wasn't. Anybody else have a comment? Yes, no, go ahead.
I guess what I wanted to say, and it's part question, part comment, is that with I think a lot of our problems stem from sheer scale of things and the way information travels. You talked about social media being a problem, and it is, but to me, it is because it is still technically very much in its infancy. We are going through changes when it comes to how to use that stuff. Obama pioneered his campaign based off of social media. He pioneered that way of doing things. And then we saw Trump do the exact same thing, except he used it for his message of divisiveness and things of that nature. And there was no way to stop him. We have companies that are developed solely on gathering data from people, the way people use social media, and then they use that data to influence the masses. And we never saw anything like that back before the internet. This is a whole new way of doing things, and we still haven't figured it out. And that's the problem. We're getting to me. That's part of the issue. The other issue for me is that we see a fear-based community. Everything, even if we see good people making bad choices because they fear for themselves rather than caring for others, and I kind of hope that the next few years we'll try to elect people, whether it's the president or our local governors, to really, instead of preach this whole we're not doing enough, maybe we just show we elect people that are trying to show the way to go. This is a point of view from somebody with far less life experience than most of you. And
I'll get you in a minute, Dave, but I want to ask Newt. You're much younger than most of us.
yes.
I just want to ask you a question. I don't know what field you're in and what direction you're going, but has it been easy or hard, or what's been your experience?
I have to say that I know no different. My life has taken various turns. I have made personal choices that I have learned from over the years, and I try to grow in a way that is accepting of those choices, whether I like them or not, so I don't live with regret. I try to take on my choices and my way of life as I try to figure out things for myself. That being said, the opportunities for my generation are very different. The cost of education is far higher than it ever was for people generations before.
For sure.
And it's worth, in a word, for lack of a better term, worth less. You paid less and you got more back before me. And now a college degree, great, you have a college degree. That's wonderful. But there's not a guaranteed spot. My father, he was born in Norway in the middle of World War II. He was born in 43, and he grew up in poverty and worked his way through the ranks on the ships. He left when he was 15, and he stayed with that career until very late in his life. And that's just not seen anymore. Now people change careers at the drop of a hat because of the way that the fast process, or the fast constant changes in how people run things. It's like it's keeping up. It's like if you're an Olympic sprinter and you ask somebody who's an average everyday Joe to keep up with that Olympic sprinter, you're going to have to give them some time to work on it, instead of just say, well, keep up with the times. It is what it is. I'm an educator. I do have a degree, but I'm an educational assistant. So I mean, yes, I do teach, but I am.
But you're not making a lot of money.
No, not at all. Not at all. I am not. It has been incremental, very incremental. I mean, technically, I am probably still considered. I mean, we're just above the poverty line, I think, technically, and that's with 2 incomes combined. So, it is difficult, but like I said before, I don't know much different. I've never had a job. I've never carried a job that paid me more than $25,000 a year. Not in my life.
Oh, wow.
And so, I'm working towards things that will probably make that better. I was slow to mature, so I have plenty to learn still, and I'm looking forward to those lessons and all that. But it's going to be it's a journey. I've been trying to do it kind of like Frank Sinatra said. I'm doing it my way, and and
well, thank you. Now, David, you had a comment to make, or question.
Yeah, the article you mentioned talked about the survey and the U.S. going to hell in a handbasket kind of a thing. But that said, for example, until the pandemic came, that people across the world were still wanting to come to the U.S. They were tourists here. They wanted to immigrate here and everything else. And yet the other options now looking forward would be, yeah, you like Putin. Well, do you want to go to Russia to live?
Right.
For various reasons, and so on. And did the article address any of that? Because clearly we have this aura, even though we all carry guns and are terrible individualism, we sort of have a good rep. Yeah,
well, I teach, as Jim has at the university here, and I've taught there about 10 or 12 years. And when I first came here, there was about 30%, 40% Hispanics, something like that. Now it's 60% or a little bit more. And many of them have families still in Mexico. And they work in these assembly factories that do things for us, and then they ship it back here and this sort of thing. But they're lucky if they get paid $50 a day. I mean, $50 a week rather, and they get there's some lodging and various things that ain't very much. So if you're getting paid that low, of course you want to come to the U.S. I mean, of course you want to come here and have a better life, and many of them do. And so to a certain extent, yeah, we're sure better than Mexico and some other South American countries. But I can tell you that, yeah, I wouldn't want to immigrate to Russia, but I wouldn't. Back earlier, I spent a fair amount of time in New Zealand and Australia. I wanted to immigrate to New Zealand. I would have done it in a second, except my wife didn't want to leave the family. But I got to tell you, I would have moved there in a minute. A minute. And good health care, good education, good style of living. And so there are places that today are better than the U.S. David Steele, you had a comment you wanted to make.
Yeah. Well, there's several thoughts that are rattling around in my nearly empty head. Yeah, but I have to admit, I'm very, very pessimistic. I don't know how you get the genie back in the bottle in terms of the divisions that we're facing now. You add in the complication of our divisions play right into the hands of people who are not interested in us prospering or being that shining city on the hill. The Russians had a material impact on the 2016 election via the social media route. There's our FBI tells us that if we can believe our FBI anymore, that that they are, our intelligence community tells us that those kinds of bad actions are taking place right now. But those bad actions play right into the hands of the people who are in power, and the Trump administration and the right wing, and they're not interested in countering those effects. We have the right wing is doing everything it can to suppress the voter turnout and to ensure that that Trump is elected by hook or crook, and they don't care which one that is. And so this idea that somehow we can overcome these divisions and recapture a past that maybe is now maybe a mythic past, because if you look at what happened in terms of just in the 20th century, just in terms of the 20th century, I mean, this country was not a friendly place towards immigrants. It has always, Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf, he wrote in his book that the country that was doing the best job of preserving its national heritage was the United States of America. Yep. So I think that again, I'm just feeling very pessimistic.
You don't have much hope. I go back to what Jim said. We live in such a polarized society that are we ever going to be able to overcome that? I don't know. Anybody else want to make a comment?
Let me make a quick comment. One of the things that I think keeps us from, as David indicated, putting the genie back in the bottle, or as was mentioned earlier, establishing a sense of community, we can't even agree on the facts. If you take an issue like climate change, and to me, and I've spent quite a bit of time on that, to me, the evidence is overwhelming that we've just got to deal with this issue. And yet, my friends in the eastern part of the state, in the oil patch, in Eddy and Lee counties, they don't agree with that. And these are not stupid people. They are people that have more than an average amount of education. They are technical people. They are engineers. They are people who are in management positions that work for oil field companies. And because it's in the interest of their group, they won't even listen. They won't even listen. And we've got to find a way to at least agree on the basic facts, or we'll never establish that sense of community or put the genie back in the bottle. And like all things, we're never going back to the 1950s and Leave It to Beaver and these nice little houses with 2 kids. And, that was a myth back then.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Blacks at that point couldn't even stay in certain hotels. Let's not go there. Anybody else? We only got about 5 minutes left. Who else? Yes, go ahead, Gil.
This is Jack.
Oh, Jack, I'm sorry.
If you did not see it on Friday evening, David Brooks and Mark Shield had a 12-minute interview, as they do every Friday, and they talked about the very things we're talking about today. David Brooks said he's never been more pessimistic about the future of our country than he is now, and he gave some good reasons for it. He said a group of scholars that he was involved with, they surveyed each other on 1 to 5 of what do you think of the future. He said some of the people said, I'm a 12 on how bad things are. So go to NPR, David Brooks, Mark Shields, 12 minutes. It's worth your while.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. I respect both of them. Any other want to make a quick comment? Roger, do you want to make a comment? Oh, you got to have your thing off. Your sound.
Okay. So thanks for inviting me. It's been great, really. And thanks to Jim for bringing up climate change. As an old guy, you know, that's one that sort of looks to me like it is something that all of us should spend a little bit more thought on, including facts. And Jim brought that up. Why is it that our technical folks and our engineers and whatnot, they don't even want to talk about it, but they're smart folks. And why can't we agree on a set of facts? There must, just a comment there must be something that some of us who are in education are not doing very well, since we can't even agree as a nation on what a common set of facts are. And that's my comment. And thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. I think we're about to wrap up here unless somebody's got a quick comment.
Thank
Okay,
you.
well, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
And thank you again, Paul, for inviting me.
Thanks
Oh,
again.
it's a pleasure. Thanks for show. And next
Yeah.
week, we're going to have Susan talking about the learning and retire. You used to be over here at Good Sam's, but they're doing it virtually now, and she's going to talk about the program. Carol, you can make a comment on that. Carol? Yeah. Anyway, you don't have your sound on.
Yeah, Carol, you're muted.
You're muted. Anyway, next week, we're going to have a lady talk about the learning and senior retirement, similar. Go ahead, Carol.
Learning and retirement.
Yeah.
Jim can talk about that too.
Yeah, we're both on the board.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Academy of Learning and Retirement's been around for about 25 years. And if you've never attended one of their sessions, I highly recommend it. We used to hold them in Good Sam in the auditorium. We'd get 100, 150 people. Somebody would lecture for a while and then Q&A. Great fun, good topics. We're just finishing up a 4-session presentation on U.S. military history that's been very good. And next month are several things about elections. It's cheap. You can just Google Academy of Learning and Retirement Las Cruces, and you'll get to a link at our website, and you can sign up and join us, all virtual. That's something I opposed, but my voice didn't carry on that one.
Well, anyway, we got to wrap it up, and that'll be our program next week. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks,
very much.
guys.
That was kind of interesting. I sent it to Jonathan.